Hey, noble ones. Sorry. Welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're going to check a channel I absolutely adore, and honestly, my very favorite video from said channel. So the channel in question is called Townsend, and honestly, just want to show you the channel very quickly. It's a very wholesome guy in a very fascinating channel with, as you can see, almost 2.5 million subscribers, and absolutely deserved. So he's clearly some sort of historical reenactor, and what he does is mostly focus on cooking food that people ate. I don't think he goes as far back as the medieval period or ancient Rome, but he does have a lot of, like, I think 1700s, 1800s sort of content. Now, the video in question is called Food That Time Forgot Ship's Biscuits. Now, this is a topic I love, and it also has some connections to ancient Rome, believe it or not. And now I don't think he doesn't mention it, but I might add it for context. But then again, it's a fantastic video, and I kind of wanted to react, watch it with you. But absolutely go check out the channel, subscribe. This guy just focuses on his passion and what he loves, and he's very knowledgeable. So really a breath of fresh air.
This is a ship's biscuit. It's hardtack. It's pure condensed nutrition. If you take a family road trip today, maybe 500 miles, you definitely pack clothing, maybe some recreational gear, a laptop. You don't need to worry about food.
Sure.
You can travel and stop any number of times along the way. Gas stations, grocery stores, fast food restaurants, they are everywhere when we travel today. If you're traveling in the 18th century,
Look at that. Oh my gosh, doesn't it make you hungry? Because it makes, I'm starving now, and I've just had lunch an hour ago. Like, I don't know what it is, but I actually love the puncturing in the dough. I don't know why they make it look more appetizing to me.
you have to bring your food along with you. You never know when you might be able to find food or not. If you're a sailor on the high seas, there's no place to get food. You have to bring along every bit that you need. And it needs to be able to last through multiple different kinds of temperatures, in different situations. It needs to be condensed. It needs to be nutritious.
Because of course he's specifically talking about ships, but this works also for armies, hence me adding a little bit of context when it comes to the Roman army after I let him speak for a little bit. But of course, bread, you might think, would also be a good idea, but bread goes stale. These don't. It's ingenious if you think about it. And of course, they don't get moldy as easily because all of the water is removed. These are very dry, very, very fascinating stuff to see how people in the past were ingenious, that they were trying to overcome problems. And now today we have got technology such as refrigerators and whatnot.
I'm amazed by the resourcefulness of our forefathers in creating ship's biscuits. They check off all the difficulties on this list. I even have a ship's biscuit here that is 10 years old, and it's still probably edible. I'm going to try this at the end of the episode.
Really?
So what is a ship's biscuit? How is it made? Ship's biscuits are so very, very simple. They are an unleavened bread. We just take 2 or 3 ingredients. You just need flour, you need a little bit of water, and maybe sometimes salt. You make a very, very stiff dough, and you form it into these little biscuit shapes, and they're baked. And they're baked by the baker at a fairly low temperature and for a very long time. What we're trying to achieve here is a hardened disc of baked dough with all...
Man, that was satisfying. I know he's going to break it by hand in a second, and that's fantastic. But I think one of the reasons why I really appreciate him, apart from the, of course, overall production quality is incredible. I mean, I can learn a thing or two here on how to make a very good looking video. But one thing I really appreciate is he dresses up, which is something I try to do as well. But he's knowledgeable, not just at a theoretical level. This guy knows how to make this stuff. Like literally, if you were in a situation where you need to, like a survival skill, this guy has got it all.
Almost no moisture in it.
Yeah.
Moisture is the enemy of a ship's biscuit. It will cause it to get moldy.
Sure.
It will also attract insects. If this is dry,
Rats.
desiccated, there's nothing here for bugs to eat, and it just doesn't go bad. So it's easy to imagine a ship's voyage, and on board ship are barrels and barrels of ship's biscuits. How are they going to eat these? Sailors know when they sign up that this is the bread they're going to get
Pretty
each
much.
and every day. In
Yep.
fact, rations for a sailor every day includes a pound of bread. So they make
Very nice. Now that he's talking about rations, I'll let him finish and then I'll tell you about Roman rations.
get 6, 7, 8 ship's biscuits depending on how big they are. There are accounts where sailors don't even like soft bread. After they're used to eating these for a long period of time, they think the soft bread is actually going to be bad for them. All that air in the bread will make their stomach not digest properly. And so this is what they crave each and every day.
I mean, it makes sense. At the end of the day, I think we do get used what we like. Oftentimes, when we know the fact that you prefer or tend to prefer your own cuisine over the cuisine of other countries, although you can still appreciate those, it's normally a matter of what you're used to, because, you know, you make the best of any situation you're given. It's just the way we're built. It's hardwired into us. If rice is what is available, you'll like it. That's also why sometimes there are things, dishes and drinks that become an acquired taste. First time you try it, you don't like it. I mean, beer is one of these, for example. But then the more you get used to it, the more you present it to your body, the more your body gets used to it, gets acclimated to it, because you're giving it to. And at the end of the day, it's a survival strategy, because if rice is what you eat every day, it means that rice is what is available. Just to add a little bit to this before we continue this wonderful video, I wanted to say that I can see a lot of correlations already with the ancient Roman army specifically. So in this case, I'm not really necessarily talking about the sort of food that an average Roman citizen would eat in Rome, but I'm specifically talking about what is called cibus castrensis, so the military rations, if you will, of an army on the march. And believe it or not, hardtacks were absolutely part of it. Now, given the Romans also had regular soft bread, but the hardtack, which was called bucellatum in Latin, was a staple of the sort of food that a Roman legionary would eat. And the cool thing about it is that the Romans made it themselves. So the legionaries produced their own food, including the grinding process of the grains. Clearly, as is stated, same for ships in the, say, 18th century, same for the Roman army. If you're on the move, you're on the march. This allows you to carry food that doesn't spoil as easily, and it does help making sure that the army is well fed and has that sort of carbohydrate boosts that will help with the overall energy that a soldier will have. Now talking about the second thing that he said, which was the rations that, for example, a sailorman on a ship would get. Well, we do have information when it comes to that and the wheat that the Romans were given as well in the sources, in the sense that Polybius tells us that each soldier had 900 grams of wheat. Oftentimes that's ancient wheat, so farro, but sometimes it's also regular wheat, kind of depends, per month. This is what Polybius says. Of course, it will change depending on the campaign, and I could bring up Cicero, Flavius Josephus, Historia Augusta. All of these give us different numbers. I don't want to go too deeply into the Romans because I could make a dedicated video. Now, given I know that it has become a meme among you to say, hey, every time Metatron promises a dedicated video, take a shot and you'll get drunk very quickly. I get it. So in this case, hear me out. If you like the idea of me creating a dedicated video to what a Roman soldier would eat throughout the centuries from the Republic to the late Empire, presenting the sources, then let me know in the comments, and if I find enough comments, I will make it within the next 3 days. How about that? Back to the video.
But it's not just sailors that have to endure ship's biscuits each and every day. Soldiers are also dealing with ship's biscuits constantly. 18th century soldiers are in situations where ship's biscuits are part of their ration, especially as a substitute, and maybe not an everyday thing. Joseph Plum Martin during the Revolutionary War talks about coming up to a situation where they didn't have regular bread to give out, and so they had opened up a cask of ship's bread and say, take as much as you want. So each soldier stuffed all these ship's biscuits into their shirts and into their pockets as much as they could.
Man, imagine that.
As we move westward toward the Mississippi, frontiersmen, explorers, and settlers are using ship's biscuits as part of their provision. They are surviving on this very same thing. We also see it as a commodity used to trade with the Native Americans.
Interesting.
Later on in the 19th century, during the Civil War, soldiers had to deal with ship's biscuit the same way they did earlier, but they generally referred to it as hard bread, bread, or hardtack.
It's significant that they would just refer to it as bread. Isn't that interesting. It kind of speaks already on its own. You could give it a little bit of a context, if you will, in the sense that if something becomes the norm, then even your vocabulary will reflect so.
If you read in the diaries, you don't see the word hardtack showing up very often. I think they just plain referred to it as bread, and if they got regular bread like we know it today, they would say something special in the diary like, I got soft bread today. Through our time period where ship's biscuits become more and more important, the making of them changes. So early on, individual bakers are making ship's biscuits. Later on in the 18th century, it becomes more industrialized, and they set up bakeries right close to the ship ports. There are 5 or 6 people working on the making of ship's biscuits, and they might have 9 ovens going and teams of men making these biscuits. It turns out that they need thousands and thousands of them for maybe just an individual ship. So
That makes sense. And once again, I find another correlation with the Roman army. A little bit speculative when it comes to the sources, but we do have mentions. Do you know how many grinders they would have? The grinders meaning like the actual, I don't know if I'm using the correct term, but I'm talking about the actual stone small implement that you use, that you put like a mortar, maybe mortar is the correct word. Do you know how many stone mortars specifically dedicated to make both bread and porridge, if you will, within a Roman army? Take a guess. Well, I mean, guess in the comments, I suppose, but here it is. We are told that we had at least either one grinder per 8 soldiers, so per contubernium, which is the smallest unit of a Roman army, either one per contubernium or one shared between 16 men, so per 2 contubernia. One per 8 soldiers or one every 16. Now multiply for the number of thousands of soldiers you had in an army, and you'll see how many of these single portion mortars you had in a Roman legion on the move. Of course, this would be carried on top of wagons or animals.
The demand is very, very great. And by the time we get into the 19th century, it's totally industrialized, and machines are making them from start to finish. You'll probably say, John, is this really nutritional? Now, think about the flour in the 18th century versus flour today. These biscuits were made with the least expensive flour. Whole wheat flour, sometimes other kinds of inexpensive flours thrown in. In fact, probably much more nutritional than we can imagine. This was just meant to get you through the day. This was survival food, not trying to give you this complete wonderful nutrition that we are always thinking of today. People in the 18th century didn't have those same kinds of nutritional concepts.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, even if you look at ancient Roman soft bread, it would have been whole bread when it comes to the army, not white bread, if you will. And which at the end of the day, I mean, even if you may not like it taste-wise today, once again, it's a matter of what you're used to eating, as we were saying before, but it would be very nutritious, particularly when it comes, I think, to vitamin B, at least when they would transform the grains or use the grains to make porridge.
If we look at cookbooks in the 18th century, we will not find a recipe for ship's biscuits. They're made by the baker. They're not made in a house. And the bakers generally hand these processes down. They don't write them out. So they'll give it to your apprentice to make, and he'll make 1,000 ship's biscuits or whatever. It's also an industrial process. We do get descriptions of this, especially as the process gets more and more mechanized, and we get descriptions of the archaic method of making ship's biscuits.
I wish
I've got a couple of pounds of whole wheat flour.
Whole wheat flour. Okay, I was waiting for him to tell me what he's using. Be interesting if he shares some sources. I can, of course, share sources when it comes to the Romans and the type of grains, for example, mentioned by Julius Caesar, just to name one, but Ammianus Marcellinus mentions a few.
We're going to mix that with just enough water to make a nice stiff dough. It's going to take a little bit to get this incorporated properly. Mix it in a bowl, it makes it a little bit easier.
Nice.
I really want to make sure this dough ball is complete. It doesn't have cracks in it, any folds where there is any unincorporated flour, because at those points, the dried biscuit will fall apart. It will crack and break, and we don't want that. So we want this to be a nice, solid biscuits. If they fall apart en route, we haven't done what we needed to do. Sure. I'm going to try a couple of different techniques here kneading. One of them is to use our rolling pin as a brake. Really work this dough over and get it to be very, very smooth. And once that's done, we can start to rip it up into those larger than egg sized pieces.
You know, I understand why, of course, mechanized production is the most efficient way to make thousands of these. And obviously that would be an improvement when it comes to the necessity of the production. But then again, there is something about handmade stuff and seeing him actually using a wooden rolling pin to literally make the stuff. It just speaks to me. Is it the same for you? There is something about it's charming in a way because it's more human.
After those pieces are made, we can form our little biscuit shapes. We're looking for a hockey puck kind of style here. They are turning out very, very consistently. Since this isn't an industrial kind of situation, I'm not selling these ship's biscuits. They can vary in size a little bit. That's okay, especially for personal use. As we're forming up the biscuits, realize that these are not going to grow as they bake. If anything, they'll shrink just a little bit. So we're forming these biscuits up almost exactly the size that we want them to be when we use them.
That's experience talking. Oh, that's it.
Consistently across our biscuits and all the way to the bottom. And we're doing that so that it releases the moisture throughout the entire biscuit as it's baking, especially if they bake fairly rapidly, because what will happen is steam builds up in the inside of the biscuit and it will just sort of pop the top and create holes and gaps in our biscuit. In one sense, that's exactly what we want because we want it to be easier to eat. But in the case of a ship's biscuit where we want it to stay together until we're ready to eat it, we don't want any air gaps, we don't want any holes. And so we poke these holes and the steam will come out through those instead of puffing it up.
Yeah, I wonder I hope he's going to mention this. If not, if you are watching this and you could let me know in the comments, it would be, please let me know. But I wonder if these were just eaten by themselves or if they would be dressed in any way. Because we know that the Romans sometimes would dip them in posca or wine. So posca meaning the drink that Roman soldiers were consuming, which was made of a percentage of water and a percentage of vinegar. So it would be kind of a diluted vinegar. The amounts change and depend, and sometimes you could even add a little bit of wine to it, but generally speaking, it's non-alcoholic. It would be disinfectant, fresh, so to speak, but sometimes they would dip them in this liquid to also kind of soften them a little bit while you're eating them and give them a little bit of flavor. Other times, however, they could dress them with lard, so fat. They could do olive oil too, but olive oil usually is not carried by the army because it's expensive and harder to carry, which is why they use lard instead.
I've baked many batches of these and I've used several different techniques trying to find the best way. These take at least 2 bakes, if not 3 or 4, or you can do one very long bake at a low temperature. That's probably the best way to do it.
I think the Romans did a double bake, but I will have to double check on that, so don't quote me on it.
We don't want that steam to build up. So if we bake them very, very slowly, that steam has a chance to get out of the biscuit without it breaking and cracking. So I would say the best way to do it is about 250 degrees for 3 or 4 hours.
I'm so gonna do it.
To bake them for a while and then lower that temperature. Maybe bake them for an hour at 250 degrees, lower that temperature. I've even baked them overnight at just kind of the warm temperature in a modern oven.
I'm so going to try it.
Biscuits show up in multiple different literary references. This is from Swift's family, Robinson. We refreshed ourselves with wine and biscuit, which we found in some of the casks.
Wine and biscuit. Hey, that's similar to the Romans. Some habits are hard to die.
Whenever we have bread or biscuits coming out of a barrel, we know they are ship's biscuits. The trick with ship's biscuits is you can't just eat them. You will break your teeth. So we don't want to eat that. This is our 10-year-old ship's biscuit. I'll try this last. We have our ship's biscuits that we just made, and we can use them in lobscouse. So you can check that episode out where we just ate them in the Sailor's Feast. We also have broken up a little bit of ship's biscuit and soaked it in water.
There we go.
And here we're using it like cereal. So I've broken up the ship's biscuit by pounding it. And then
I think he really enjoys that because he keeps breaking them.
Pouring it into hot chocolate. And that's another
Really?
popular drink from the time period.
Oh, that's insane. I mean, yeah, I probably wouldn't try that. But then again, I do find, since I moved to the US, I do find that Americans love sweet stuff more than we do, in the sense that, of course, we like our sweets, but there are a lot of things in America that, like, you would add chocolate to stuff that I wouldn't, to be honest. And so I usually don't. Even sugar, the amount of sugar you guys use, I don't know if it was already the same in the 18th century, but hey, editing Metatron here, and I am wrong. I was wrong with this one, and you know, you gotta say it when you're wrong, you gotta say it. You know why I'm wrong? Oh, we have a Metatron, yeah, I can't eat this, a biscuit with chocolate, Americans, blah, blah, blah. Well, check this out. I'm having tonight, while I'm editing, I'm having freaking Digestive by McVitie's, not a sponsor. And literally, I gotta show you this, because, you know, when someone is wrong, he's wrong. It is what it is. They look like, yeah, light Metatron, you need the light. Look at this, it's like one side looked like a hardtack, right? And the other side is chocolate. So literally, I don't know what I was on about, because I love these. What are these made of? Let me see. Goodness gracious, my quality of production. Milk chocolate flavor coating, wheat biscuits. Literally, it's this. Enjoy. Thank you. And God bless America.
Let's start with this chocolate cereal.
Yeah.
Probably needs to soak a little bit longer, but reminds me of cocoa wheats. It's actually really good.
That's insane.
It's got a nice little bit of tooth and a wonderful chocolate flavor.
Yeah.
The biscuit soaked in wine, I'm kind of surprised. You can see how soft it is at this point. It's only soaked about 10 or 15 minutes. This is a little bit of Madeira, very common 18th century wine. And very nice and soft. Eats easily. And this could be dessert. So it's a bit of a dessert wine. You could soak this in water or in grog.
Sure.
Here's the big trouble, right? This ship's biscuit is over 10 years old. It's got all these extra little holes in it. I didn't make all these holes. Some of these holes are made by bugs, which is a common problem with ship's biscuits. And this one is a pretty hard one. It has been around this long, kind of a little overcooked.
There it is.
Let's break this.
Come on.
See what the inside is like.
Yeah, do it. Go for it.
There
Hey,
we go.
a medieval knight would be proud.
There's our ship's biscuit on the inside. There's some bugs in there.
Oh, no.
Little white larvae, which is a common problem in the 18th century. Sailors, they would tap the biscuits on the table to knock the bugs out or eat them in the dark because they didn't want to know what they were eating. But,
yeah, no.
see if I can get a little bit of it here.
Oh gosh, he's eating it.
Tastes almost exactly like the brand new ship's biscuit.
Extra protein in there, I suppose.
Still, after 10 or 12 years, it's just as edible as it was before. Maybe a little added protein.
Yeah, I mean, oh gosh, edible. Yeah, awesome. Absolutely awesome video. So apparently, and I did not know this, he has a second video that he produced 4 months ago called The Unbeatable Ship's Biscuit. And so he has a remake, and I wonder if this time, I mean, how can he improve it? Is it going to be on a ship, period, accurate ship? I don't know, but I am totally going to check some of it out, maybe half of it or so, because I don't want to like watch the whole video. I mean, I suppose feel free to check it out. But I was wondering if, because he only mentioned water and flour, I wonder why they're not adding salt, because the Romans did use salt, not only for taste, but sometimes when it comes to the meat, for example, for preservation as well. So I wonder if he's going to mention that on this second video. Let's go.
Imagine you're in charge of feeding 200 people. Not only that, but you are at sea for 3 months on a wooden vessel only 120 feet long. How?
Imagine you're in charge of feeding 4,200 Roman legionaries plus all the company. But yeah, in the sea.
How are you going to do this? A 32-gun frigate in the 18th century was a medium-sized warship. This ship is probably 120 or 140 feet long and maximum 30 feet wide, with an array of cannons on board. And this is the kind of ship that goes all over the world to take care of small problems. This isn't the kind of ship that's in a line of battle with giant battleships all lined up, but they go on independent missions. Now they have a very challenging environment, especially the cook. The main ship's cook has to cook for all the normal sailors on board as well as the soldiers.
I think when it comes to this, then, of course, this is a 200-man operation, but I think when it comes to this, then the Romans were more organized because, as I was mentioning, each soldier was supposed to take care of his own rations. And that way, you didn't have to have one single cook that has to take care of 200 men or more. I like that of the Romans. I suppose this is done for efficiency so that soldiers can do other things, and sailor men, of course, on top of a ship have to take care of a lot of things, the ropes and the sails, I'm sure the cleaning, patrolling. I'm sure there is a lot that needs to be done on a ship. But then again, I do think that the Romans were very ingenious when it comes to, oh, you want to eat bread? You got to make your own bread, mate. After you made patrol, guard duty, built a bridge, created a couple of streets, and fought the barbarians in combat. Make your bread and polish your armor.
And he has to get these men fed in a very, very short period of time, because there is a special cook that does the cooking just for the officers, and then probably a cook just for the captain himself.
I can add something else again. The Roman sources tell us that sometimes both the emperors, as they were going on campaign, and the legati, so the generals, would eat with the soldiers the same food that the soldiers ate. Not all the time, but every time they do, they are praised in the sources, because then it's a way to say, look how frugal and how humble our emperor, our general is, and that was a way actually to boost morale and the attachment, sort of the respect of the soldiers. This is in the sources, and it's fascinating.
Moving all these soldiers and sailors over the ocean in this rickety wooden vessel calls for a very complex and rigid system of rules, a tradition that has to extend for centuries. For all this tradition, it's amazing how many people wanted to change the Navy and to change things going on in this late 18th century. So John Cochrane writes this little book called The Seaman's Guide. But basically, this book is mostly all about...
Oh, that name. Oh, the title is horrible.
...about bread. And how can we bake bread on board ship? The standard sailor's ration of this time period was a gallon of beer, and every day they would get a pound of ship's biscuits. And ship's biscuits are the hardest bread known to mankind. You can use them to hammer in a nail. The author here thinks that soft bread would be so much better for these sailors. And
I wonder why. Although then again, now that I look at that bread, which he probably made, I mean, that looks amazing. Gosh, look how flaky. I'm gonna have to eat after this video. Since he mentioned that beer was part of the rations, do you think that the Romans did get to drink beer in the military or not? Please pause the video and give me your answer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Believe it or not, it was a little bit of a tricky question, because at first, and it kind of depends on the period, in the Republic, early Empire, no, beer is the drink of the barbarians. But we do have sources that mention the fact that by the late Roman Empire, particularly in those areas that had to do with Celtic cultures, the Romans actually got accustomed to drinking beer. And I mean the legionaries.
How can soft bread be baked on board ship? There are different problems with bringing bread on board ship. If we're at sea for months at a time, we can't bring soft bread from on land. It's going to get bad in just a couple of days. Certainly by the first week, it's already starting to turn green. It might sound easy to bake bread at sea, but we have a lot of different kinds of problems. We need to have a fairly large oven, and we need to have the materials. Flour, that's no problem, but yeast is the big problem. And he spends most of the book here talking about the problem of yeast at sea.
Interesting.
Bread in Great Britain and North America at the time was mostly baked with a liquid yeast that you got from the brewer. Now that's a problem at sea. There is no brewer right down the street that we can go get our yeast. So how do they
Right down the wave.
do this? How do they leaven bread at sea? What John Cochran is suggesting here is called either the old dough technique or the leaven technique. And this is a bread method they were using on the continent in Europe, especially France and other places. So this is the typical liquid yeast that people would be making their bread with in Great Britain and North America. They would get this from the brewer and they would get it fresh every time. This might have a little bit of hopsy flavor to it, but mostly it's probably from ale, which doesn't have a lot of hops in it and it wouldn't be very bitter. So what happens if we can't get that? If we're on board ship, then we can use this leaven technique, and we talked about it before. It has to do with taking a lump of dough from a bread baking that you've already done a previous day, 2 or 3 days previously. When you've done this, you tear off a specific section of dough and you leave it behind for your next day's bread, or maybe 2 or 3 days in advance.
I wonder if it has to do with like how you make sourdough, but then again, I'm no expert whatsoever, so I may have just said something that makes absolutely no sense.
Yeast will stay alive, and he takes a long time talking about the 3 stages of yeast inside your bread. Now remember, 1797, they did not know what yeast really was. They had no way of understanding exactly its essence. So they just knew that if you used this old dough, that the yeast was still alive in that, and that it would go through these 3 stages of kind of a early fermentation stage, a standard fermentation stage, and then a late stage, which he calls putrid.
Well, it's impressive. It is impressive. And at the end of the day, I think all of this has to do with experiential knowledge, in the sense that you may not know what happens at a molecular level, of course. You may not know what's going on from a scientific point of view. But then again, that doesn't mean that you can't learn from doing at the end of the day. And that's how smithing happened, even though they didn't know exactly what was happening to steel, to iron, when they were adding carbon to iron, and the details of it that now we do because we have microscopic knowledge. But then again, they could see it, they could test it. If I do this, it's brittle, so not good, which means too much carbon content. And then if I do this other thing, the heat treatment, then it's better. And of course, this happens over hundreds and hundreds of years, which is how knowledge is really accrued, by testing, which at the end of the day is the scientific method. So even though it's not modern science per se, because people in the 18th century, people in ancient Rome lacked the tech to be able to fully comprehend what was going on. But then again, they did still have a tested and true method, which was the very basis of science, if you think about it. And for example, there is a passage that I've mentioned already on a couple of videos of mine, where the Romans are discussing where you should create a household or a homestead, and they tell us stay away from the swamps, because otherwise you could get sick. And the way they describe that is fascinating, because not only you'd be like, well, of course, they figured that one out because probably they've had people getting sick, and all these people were living or maybe traversing the swamps, and of course the swamps didn't really look clean, so cleanliness and all that, maybe they made the connection. But the reality is that the sources actually tell us that the reason why you get sick is because there are very, very minute small creatures that are invisible to the eye, that enter your body through the nose and the mouth and cause sickness, and they inhabit swampland and marshes. That's tremendous as something that you figure out without the technology. Just wanted to point that out.
Bacteria actually starts to live in it, and it gets very sour and almost, well, smelling like rotten bread. That's what happens if we just leave dough around for 3 or 4 days. It starts to go really bad. But he says if we keep feeding this yeast with fresh flour, it will stay in a proper fermentation stage, and we can just keep using it and using it and using it. And so that's the technique that he really wants us to kind of embrace. A technique that was used for hundreds of years over in France and other places in Europe, and even as he was speaking, was starting to be used in places like Edinburgh.
Fantastic.
I think the reason why in France and other places they're using this old dough technique is because they don't have the fresh yeast either. In that instead of drinking beer and ale, they're drinking wine.
That's very probable, and it may also vary geographically because, of course, when you say France, well, it's a big country. Well, not big compared to the United States, but it is big. Therefore, a village in a rural area, maybe if you live in a city, that you could have access to beer more easily. But if you live in a rural area and you don't, then you will be ingenious about it, which is how humans are.
And they don't have access to that same kind of yeast, so they are kind of forced to use this old dough technique. For the bread that Cochrane suggested, we have just 4 ingredients, and these are the standard 4 ingredients that every real bread in the 18th century is made out of. We have flour, we have water, we have salt, and we have whatever we're using, leaven or yeast. So I've got flour here and a little bit of salt and water, and then we're going to take this lump of dough from a couple of days ago and we're going to break it up, and it'll work its way through our entire loaf. To mix our bread, I'm not even going to do any great quantity of measuring, and they certainly didn't do that in the 18th century. They took a large pile of flour and they start mixing the ingredients in. We are just trying to get to a certain consistency. After that's all kneaded and mixed together, we're going to set it aside to rise, and we'll let that rise for a couple of hours, maybe longer, depending on how warm our environment is. And since this old dough, it may be 3 or 4 generations old, it might take a little bit longer, but that's okay. Maybe it might take all evening or an entire day, but it'll work out as long as we give it a little bit of time and where it's not too cold.
I'm really fascinated to see what this is going to look like.
After it's risen once, we can go ahead and punch that down, knead it a little bit, and let it rise another amount of time. Generally, it doesn't have to rise quite as long that second time, and form it up into our loaf. Then after its second rising, we can put it right into the oven. Depending on the size of your loaf, if you're baking this into a modern oven, I'd go ahead and set it at 400 degrees, and it might bake for 30 minutes. Bread isn't some magical
How do you know that that's 400 degrees? That looked like a stone oven.
stuff. It is something that just about anybody can make, and I really want to encourage everyone to try this out.
I will.
It may not be the perfect loaf of bread like you get in the grocery store, but that's not what they had in the 18th century, and that's not real bread anyway. So what is it like on board ship
That's a strong statement there. I wonder what he means. I wish he expanded on it.
when you are the cook? What is your ship's galley like? As they move into the 18th century, a special kind of...
Okay, well then, I think for this whole section that goes a little more technical on the ship, I would suggest to just, check out the video, I suppose. But for today, I think we found enough when it comes to the hardtack and the correlations between what people did in the 18th century on a ship and what the ancient Romans did in the freaking 1st century on land. I don't want to say on a ship. I want to have to see, because Wegettius speaks a lot about the Roman Navy in Britannia, and of course that's where we are told that the fact that, for example, they had specific color palettes selection for specific camouflage reasons. So that, when you see a Roman blue shield, blue tunic, probably blue sails, and everything was what is called Venetian blue, because it was a very similar color to the sea, the waves of the sea. They did it for camouflage. It was a form of early camouflage. Now, I know we are told details like that. I wonder if I can find, I'm going to double check with my team, but I want to see if, particularly the classicist specialist, but I want to see if we can find some information when it comes to the sort of food that the Romans brought with them on a ship specifically, to see if there is a difference between the food on land and the food for the soldiers at sea. So I will add that as well, if I can find it. I don't know if we have the sources, but I'll add that to the dedicated video if you want me to make it. Of course, let me know in the comments, and do share this video. And of course, let me know if you like this idea in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. See you tomorrow.